Hi, crime enthusiasts. This is your host Ashita, and the story I have for you today is about Chris Coleman, a man who had a life many would envy, a high paying job as the head of security for celebrity evangelist Joyce Meyer, a picture perfect family, and a comfortable home in Columbia, Illinois. But beneath the surface, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. In late 2008, Chris reported a series of chilling threats, emails warning that his family was in danger. Even Joyce Mayer and some of her relatives were targeted. Then, a letter appeared in his mailbox at home, escalating the fear. Fast forward to May 5th, 2009, Chris, as he often did, went to the gym early in the morning, but this time something felt off. His wife, 31-year-old Sheri, wasn't answering her phone. Growing uneasy, he called the police, asking them to check on her and their two young sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Kevin. When officers arrived at the Coleman house, the scene was disturbing. A basement window had been left open, and inside, chilling words like punished were sprayed painted across the walls. Moments later, they made a devastating discovery. Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin had been strangled to death in their beds. At first glance, it seemed like a horrific crime fueled by an outside threat. But as investigators dug deeper, cracks in Chris' story began to show. The threatening emails, they were traced back to his own laptop. The timeline, it didn't add up. Autopsy results revealed his family was murdered before he ever left for the gym. And perhaps the most damning clue of all, Sheri had confided in loved ones that her marriage was crumbling, that Chris had been cruel to her. She had even made one chilling prediction. If anything ever happened to her, Chris would be the one to blame. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was something far more sinister. From the outside, Chris Coleman's childhood seemed picture perfect, rooted in faith, family, and small town values. His parents, Ron and Connie Coleman, were well known pastors, leading a church that drew worshippers from miles around. Sundays were filled with gospel music, scripture readings, and fearing sermons about righteousness and redemption. The Coleman boys grew up immersed it in all in, learning to speak in tongues and seeking guidance from the Bible in every decision. But Chris was different, reserved, the quietest of the three blonde-haired, well-mannered brothers. His mother insists the strongest curse word she had ever heard him say was piss. His junior high coach, Charlie Mattingly, remembers him as a polite, level-headed kid who rarely lost his temper. Even the one time he drank in high school while his parents were out of town, guilt gnawed at him so badly that he called his basketball coach to confess. Hunting with his father? Absolutely not. Seeing a butchered rabbit had nearly brought him to tears. Then came the Marines. A recruiter visited his high school, and Chris was captivated. The discipline, the pride, the way the man carried himself. He enlisted right after graduation. His father thought that he would stay in the military for life if it weren't for Clinton, Monica, and all that nonsense. And then, of course, there was Sheri. They met at a canine training center in San Antonio. He was 22, collecting military honors. She was 21, on MP in the US Air Force. 3 months later, in August 1997, Chris pulled into his parents' driveway with a young woman by his side. Ron stood by the window, watching the car roll up. A woman stepped out, petite, confident, and nothing like the girl he had imagined for his son. "Connie," he called out, eyes still on the driveway. "He's got somebody with him." Chris walked in, his usual quiet demeanor intact. He introduced Sheri as a friend from Chicago, casually mentioning that he was giving her a ride home. Ron and Connie exchanged glances. The signs were there. Shorts, a tattoo on her leg, she was outgoing, not the kind of girl they expected their son to be serious about. Chris didn't stay long. He said he had to take her home and then turned and walked back to the car. Hours passed, then morning came. The phone rang. Ron answered, his voice groggy from sleep. "Dad," Chris blurted out, his face loaded with a nervous excitement. "You'll never believe what we did." Ron sat up, bracing himself. "What?" "We got married." Silence. A long, heavy pause. "Dad, you don't sound excited." Ron exhaled, his voice measured. "Give me a few minutes." Chris, the boy who was raised to follow the teachings of the church, already knew the mistake he had made. He scrambled to explain, telling his parents he just got caught up in the moment. Connie's voice was gentle but firm. "Well, it's a lifetime." But in the days that followed, a truth emerged, one that put the rushed wedding into perspective. Sheri was already pregnant. Joyce Meyer, the renowned televangelist and leader of an international Christian ministry, had known the Coleman family for years. When she brought Chris into her security team, it wasn't long before he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming her personal bodyguard, a role that came with a six-figure salary and an air of prestige. The Coleman family seemed to be living the picture-perfect life. Their two-story home on Robert Drive in Columbia, Illinois, was a short drive from Chris's parents in Chester. To friends and neighbors, they appeared to be a loving couple, raising two bright and energetic boys, Gavin and Garrett. From the outside, they were the kind of family people admired, but behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. Sheri was whirlwind of energy, fun, uninhibited, and full of life when Chris met her at 21. She had a contagious laugh, a wild streak, and an effortless charm that drew people in. 3 months later, she was pregnant. In a rush of commitment and faith, they got married. Sheri was born again, trading her carefree ways for a life devoted to family, church, and mission work. 12 years later, she had fully embraced her role as a mother to their two sons, an active churchgoer, and a woman determined to make a difference. Destiny Church in West St. Louis County became her second home. She wasn't just another face in the congregation. She organized trivia fundraisers, hosted buy something parties, and poured her heart into holiday celebrations for the kids. When a friend needed help, Sheri didn't hesitate. She even paid for an entire kitchen renovation just because she could. She had her quirks. She loved SpongeBob SquarePants, MASH reruns, and still swooned over new kids on the block. But at her core, she was a giver. She bought food and blankets for the homeless and spent nights driving around St. Louis, handing them out. The now famous family portraits taken by photographer Sheri Daniel, captured them in pristine white outfits, smiling like they had stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog. No tension, no forced happiness, just a picture perfect family. Gavin, the younger son, was firecracker, full of energy and humor, just like his mom. Garrett was just as playful, but had an obedient, respectful streak. Chris was different, firm and disciplined. In public, he ensured that the boys were well behaved, reminding them of how to act at restaurants. When Sheri's friend, Rage Rix, dismissed it, saying they were just kids, Chris remained unwavering, unwilling to be embarrassed. He wasn't a warm father, rarely showing affection to his boys or Sheri, but he was present, coaching their teams, tossing the football in the yard, and offering rewards for good behavior. He praised their efforts, celebrating a great catch or suggesting a snow cone as a treat. His job as a bodyguard, he once reassured his mother, wasn't about the brute strength, but about presence. Looking tough, maintaining an intimidating demeanor, and never smiling. But by the spring of 2009, something had shifted. He was growing out of his hair. The Saturday before the murders, he visited Vida Pure Nature Salon in Colombia for a trim, meeting Sheri there, and after she had her passport photo taken for an upcoming mission trip. Flashing her a grin, he playfully asked if he had smiled for the picture. With the boys away on a camping trip, they had a rare night out, an actual date. Stylist Emily Worthen recalled how excited they seemed, watching them leave and commenting on how cute they were. Even Rich had noticed the change. When she teased Chris about his hair, he grinned and told her he was a changed man. Sheri's love for giving clashed with Chris' love for having. She spent freely on others while he focused on making money. She devoted herself to mission trips, serving in those in need while he worked for security and status. Her generosity extended to both charity and shopping sprees. Much to Chris's amusement, he would tease her about her transformation, reminding her of her wilder days and playfully calling her a holy roller. Sheri had a friend once like that, Tara Lenz, a former hostess at a gentleman's club, a cocktail waitress at a dog track in St. Petersburg. Sheri only mentioned her once, with sadness. I pray for her, she had said. She never said it outright, but deep down, she knew. She used to be like Tara. Chris met Tara Lenz through his wife Sheri. The two women had been inseparable in high school, best friends at Largo High in Florida. They even shared a striking resemblance, both dark hair, fit, and effortlessly beautiful. To detectives, Chris described Tara's personality as nearly identical to Sheri's. Easygoing, never demanding. But their relationship was far from innocent. In the days following the murders, police interviewed Lenz in St. Petersburg, Florida, where she revealed the truth. She and Chris had been having an affair. Their explicit conversations had played out over phone calls and emails, and their physical relationship had begun in November 2008. It wasn't just a fling. Tara admitted that they had made plans. Chris would divorce Sheri, and by 2010, they would be married. During this time, Sheri began noticing a shift in Chris's behavior. He had grown distant, impatient, like a man with one foot out the door. Suspicious, she confided in friends, voicing her fears that he was having an affair. But it wasn't just infidelity that unsettled her. One chilling remark stood out, a warning she gave a friend in confidence. If something happens to me, Chris did it. On the morning of May 5th, 2009, Chris Coleman left his home on Robert Drive for his usual workout at a gym in St. Louis County. While at the gym, he called Sheri's cell phone and left a voicemail. When she didn't respond, he followed up with a text. Still, no reply. On his way home, he called again. Nothing. Growing uneasy, Chris reached out to his neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow of the Columbia Police Department. At 6:42 a.m., Barlow's phone rang, pulling him from the haze of early morning exhaustion. Just 3 hours earlier, he had been pacing his house, rocking his restless 6-month-old back to sleep. But now, as he answered the call, his eyes drifted to the Coleman house across the street. The threats Chris and Sheri had been receiving had been on his mind. Were they as serious as they seemed, or was something far worse unfolding right next door? The emails started on November 14th, rude and menacing. They railed against televangelist Joyce Meyer, branding her sermons as bullshit. But it wasn't Meyer or her family being targeted. The threats were aimed at her personal bodyguard, Chris Coleman, and his family. I will kill them all while they sleep, one message warned. Then, the threats escalated. Letters began showing up in the Coleman's mailbox. Most recent, dated April 27th, carried a chilling finality. This is my last warning. Your worst nightmare is about to happen. The words rattled Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow. He just lived across the street from the Colemans, and as a member of the Columbia Police Department, he knew enough to take threats like this seriously. He offered to mount a surveillance camera in his 3-year-old son's bedroom window, positioning it directly at the Coleman's mailbox, hoping to catch whoever was behind the messages. The camera was running now, quietly whirring in the background, recording nothing but an empty street as Chris Coleman's crackled over the phone. My wife's not answering the phone. I need you to check on her and the kids. I'm on the JB Bridge and I'll be there in about 5 minutes. Barlow sat up first. Something about Chris's tone struck him. Urgent but not frantic. A request, not a plea. He pulled on his clothes, grabbed his weapon, handcuffs, and radio, and called his dispatcher at the Columbia Police Department as he hurried outside. Chris's home was just across the street, eerily quiet. He knocked, no answer. He rang the doorbell, nothing. A police cruiser pulled up just then, Officer Jason Donjan stepping out. Nobody's answering, Barlow called over. Donjan nodded and moved toward the back of the house. He was long gone before Barlow's radio crackled. You'd better come back here. There's a window open, the screen's out. A cold wave of unease crawled up Barlow's spine. They both knew what that meant. They radioed for backup and climbed in through the open basement window. The moment their feet hit the floor, the air felt wrong. Thick, silent. A smell hung in the air, sharp and chemical. Paint. Guns down. They cleared the basement and moved cautiously up the steps. Donjan in uniform took the lead. As they stepped out onto the first floor, the full horror of what happened here came into view. Bright red spray covered the walls. The words dripped like fresh wounds. Punished. I'm always watching. Their eyes followed the smears of red up the staircase. You have paid. The paint fumes burned their nostrils, but they pressed on. Whatever had happened in this house had happened first, and it happened violently. At 6:56 a.m., just 13 minutes after his call from the bridge, Chris Coleman's silver Ford Explorer pulled into the driveway. Stepping out, he scanned the house as another officer, Steve Payton, arrived at the same time. Officers Barlow and Donjon met him on the porch, instructing him to stay outside. Chris didn't argue. He sank onto the grass, hands clasped behind his head. Inside, Donjon led the way upstairs, gun down, follow the spray-painted threads that served as a green rope map. With each step, that certainly grew. What awaited them at the top was nothing good. Donjon moved toward the master bedroom while Barlow hesitated before stepping into one of the children's rooms. A little boy lay in bed, half covered, as if peacefully sleeping, until Barlow noticed the mottled grey skin and unnatural stiffness of his limbs. His stomach clenched. From the hallway, Donjon's voice rang out. He had found Sheri. Patton entered the second child's room, and soon, confined, Gavin was there as well. Forcing himself to move, Barlow stepped into the next doorway, breath catching in his throat. 2 children, both gone. Then he saw the dark, angry ligature marks circling their small necks, deep bruises suggesting that they have been strangled with a rope or caught. Sheri had suffered the same fate. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was calculated. The officers realized that they needed to be cautious. Whoever had done this might be still inside. Patton turned to Barlow and quietly suggested limiting what they told Chris, suspecting he could be their guy. Barlow nodded, steadying himself before heading back downstairs. Chris remained outside, hunched over the ground. Exhaling, Barlow delivered the news. They didn't make it, Chris. Chris didn't react as expected. He didn't speak, protest, or demand to see his family. Instead, he sat there, sobbing into his hands, then pulled out his phone and called his father. Chief Joe Edwards crouches next to Chris, his voice measured as he delivers the devastating news. Chris, your family is gone. Chris doesn't react immediately. Edwards glances toward the flashing cameras across the street. The media have already arrived. To avoid the growing spectacle, he suggests moving Chris to the ambulance, that the chaplain will sit with him. Chris doesn't protest and silently follows Reverend Jonathan Peters. A car screeches to a stop on the lawn, and before the engine even shuts off, Reverend Ron Coleman, Chris's father, jumps out. His face is ghost white as he pushes past officers and ducks under the crime scene tapes. Minutes later, another car pulls in, and Joyce Mayer steps out. Inside the ambulance, Chris stares at him, absent-mindedly brushing his fingers over the red marks on his skin. His voice is barely a whisper as he questions, almost to himself. How did that get there? Then, without warning, his breathing shifts. His fists clench, and he suddenly starts slamming them against the gurney in a violent burst of emotion. Chief Edwards wastes no time. Pulling out his phone, he dials Major Jeff Connor of the major case of Greater St. Louis. I need the best of the best, he says. Connor doesn't hesitate. Officers begin arriving from all over, securing the scene and launching the investigation. At the Columbia Police Department, Chris sits down in a grey interview room. His cut-off t-shirt offers little protection against the cold. Shivering, he mutters under his breath, "I am cold." The interrogation room felt even smaller as the minutes dragged on. Chris sat hunched over, rubbing his arms absent-mindedly, his fingers tracing the red marks on his skin. He had been answering questions all night, his words coming in rehearsed, measured sentences, but there was something missing, something just beneath the surface. The detectives had already left and returned multiple times, giving him space to unravel on his own. But Chris was careful, too careful. Each time they re-entered, he adjusted, wiping his face, shifting in his chair, straightening his shoulder, as if bracing for another round. He had gone over his timeline for more than once. He got up at 5:30, used the bathroom, got dressed, and left. Called Sheri to wake her up. She didn't answer. Drove to the gym, walked out, called her again. No answer. That's when he called the police. But something didn't sit right. The detectives knew it. And deep down, Chris knew it too. The day before had been a normal one, or at least that's how he painted it. He had been home for most of the day, running errands here and there. Picked up the kids from school. Played catch with Garrett in the yard while waiting for Sheri to return from work. They had dinner together. Sheri cooked. Later, the family had walked up to the snow cone stand, a small tree to round out an ordinary day. Then, after returning home, he played catch with Gavin for a while before heading back Zach's gym. When he got back, he helped tuck the kids into bed. Sheri had been in Gavin's room, rubbing steroid cream on his poison ivy while Chris listened to Garrett's prayers. Afterward, they settled on the couch, watching Batman Returns. Sheri curled up beside him. Eventually, she fell asleep in his arms. He had relayed all of this effortlessly, almost as if he had been waiting to say it. Every detail neatly packaged, every sentence fluid. But there was something about the way he spoke, like a man carefully laying bricks in a story that needed to be told. Outside that room, the investigation was moving at a rapid pace. Officers were digging into phone records, retracing steps, verifying alibis. Then a name surfaced: Tara Lynns. Chris had mentioned her in passing, calling her a family friend. But something about the way he had said it raised a flag. A team in St. Petersburg, Florida had already found her, and she was being questioned. Unlike Chris, she wasn't getting a patient approach. They were pushing her hard, and she was cracking faster than he was. Chris had also been eager to talk about his job, Joyce Mayer's personal security, a big role. He spoke with pride, emphasizing how Joyce's presence extended across the world and how she was broadcasted in 37 languages. He even brought up his own security company, Executive Innovations, which he had just started. But what he hadn't brought up, at least not until they prompted him, was his home security camera. The one thing that could have captured an intruder. The one thing he should have checked first. Chris sat in the interrogation room, shifting in his seat. The weight of the questions pressed down on him, his words coming out and defensive. He insisted that he had been honest, that Sheri was alive when he left. But the detectives weren't convinced. They had more information that he realized, and they were about to push harder. When asked if he truly believed Sheri had been alive that morning, his response wavered. He started strong, but doubt crept in. He stammered, corrected himself, and then repeated the statement, as if saying it enough times would make it true. The detectives didn't buy it. They knew how forensic teams worked. Time of death wasn't a mystery that could be argued. It was a science. When they brought this up, Chris gave a weak laugh, mentioning how he had seen it on TV. They left him alone, and Chris struggled to stay still. His hand fidgeted, his eyes darted around the room. The silence pressed in, the air of thick, unspoken accusations. Restless, he stood up, paced a little, then noticed something on the table. One of the detective's notepads, left behind. He hesitated only for a moment before picking it up. Flipping back a page, he scanned the scribbled notes. His face tightened as he read. Then, just as quickly as he grabbed it, he put it back down and returned to his chair, breathing heavily. When the detectives returned, they laid out the most damning question yet. If Chris truly believed an intruder had been watching, waiting for the right moment, how did he explain it? How did he rationalize someone sneaking in at that perfect time, undetected, without a single thing out of place? Chris had no real answer. He simply said that was the only possibility. There was nothing else he could think of. They left him alone once more. This time, he cracked. The sobs came suddenly, loud and forceful, his body shaking with them. He hunched forward, burying his face in his hands. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped. He took a deep breath. He wiped his face. He picked up his water and took a slow sip. Outside the room, voices murmured. Chris reached for his jacket and pulled it across his front, covering his arm. Then he waited. Coleman's family laid Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett to rest on May 9th at Evergreen Cemetery in Chester. It was a quite somber affair, the weight of grief pressing heavy on those who gathered. Words were spoken, prayers were whispered, but there was an unshakable tension in the air, an absence that fell louder than any eulogy. Days later, Sheri's family made their own arrangements, bringing the bodies to a funeral home in Chicago suburb for a visitation. This was their moment to say goodbye, to grieve in their own way, surrounded by people who had known and loved Sheri and the boys the most. Chris Coleman was nowhere to be seen. He didn't make the trip, didn't stand beside Sheri's parents as they wept over their daughter's coffin, didn't face the community that had watched their love story unfold, only to end in an unimaginable tragedy. He stayed away, letting his absence speak for him. And for those who had already begun to suspect the worst, that absence said everything. The investigation was methodical, relentless. DNA samples were brought into the Illinois State Lab, each one carrying the weight of the case. The results came back. Under Sheri's fingernails, they found a partial DNA profile. It could have been Chris. But then again, it could have been any male with a similar pattern. Nothing in the house pointed to an intruder. No foreign fingerprints, no clear evidence of a struggle with a stranger. From the moment the crime scene technicians stepped inside the house, they had worked with precision. Flecks of paint were scraped from the walls with a scalpel. A black gel captured faint footprint impressions. Every possible clue was carefully sealed away. Hairs, fibers, latex gloves. A Jeep, a Glock pistol, a car pistol, every shoelace, every phone cord that had been used in the strangulation. 2 cell phones, a BlackBerry, and 2 laptops. Each item held the possibility of a breakthrough. And then, almost immediately, one came. The threatening emails sent to Joyce Mayer and her son Danny and Chris Coleman himself on November 14th had all come from Chris's own laptop. The email account destroychris@gmail.com had been created on that very same laptop the night the threats began. It wasn't just the account that tied it back to him. Buried in his work files was a single mistake, a misspelling, opportunities. The exact same misspelling Sheri had pointed out in one of the threat letters. The evidence wasn't just mounting, it was closing in. Evidence surfaced along a stretch of Interstate 255 near the Jefferson Barracks Bridge, right along the route. Investigators combed the area carefully, collecting whatever they could, piecing together a timeline that no longer seemed to fit Chris's version of events. But then came the breakthrough. Cell phone tracking data revealed something strange. On the morning of May 5th, Chris hadn't taken his usual route home. Instead, he had taken a longer, more indirect path, one that now held even greater significance. By this point, the threatening emails, staged break-in, the evidence piling up against him, it was no longer just a theory. Days later, Major Jeff Connor, the head of the Major Case Squad, addressed reporters with a quiet certainty. He didn't mention the names, but his message was clear. He believed they knew exactly who had killed Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett. Then came a crucial call. Dr. Michael Baton, a world-renowned forensic pathologist, who was brought in to review the case. His conclusion was damning. Based on the evidence, he was certain Sheri and the boys had been murdered long before Chris left the house that morning. With that, the final nail was hammered into the illusion Chris had so carefully constructed. The walls were closing in, and soon there would be no place left for him to hide. By the spring of 2011, the courtroom was set for one of the most chilling trials Monroe County had ever seen. A man accused of murdering his own wife and children, a mistress waiting in the wings, and a staged crime scene so elaborate it could have been plucked from the pages of a crime novel. Partial hearings began with Judge Milton Wharton carefully weighing what the jury would be allowed to hear. The defense, grasping at any possible lifeline, objected fiercely to the testimony of Robert Leonard, a linguistic expert whose finding they dismissed as unscientific. But the prosecution pressed on, determined to unravel the carefully woven facade Chris Coleman had tried to maintain. They painted a picture of a man suffocating under the weight of his double life, trapped in a marriage he no longer wanted, desperate to be with his mistress, and willing to risk everything to break free. But instead of walking away like any other man, he devised a monstrous plan. He would rid himself of his family and pin the blame on a shadowy intruder. Detectives from the Columbia Police Department took the stand, recounting the horrific scene inside the Coleman home on the morning of May 5th, 2009. Among them was Justin Barlow, the Coleman's next-door neighbor and an officer himself, who had reviewed his own surveillance footage and made the first grisly discovery. One detective recalled finding a receipt for red spray tucked inside Chris Coleman's house, evidence that directly linked him to the chilling threats scrawled across the walls in his family's bloodied home. And then came Joyce Mayer's testimony. The televangelist, who had been Chris's employer, spoke to the court via recorded deposition. She had admitted she had no knowledge of his affair, but made one thing clear. If she had known, Chris would have been fired. Yet, she also considered that her ministry had employed people who had been divorced before. It was a moment that sent a ripple through the courtroom. Had Chris Coleman truly believed his job was on the line if he left Sheri? Was that his twisted justification for murder? Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Tara Lynch, the mistress, the woman Chris Coleman had risked everything for, was ordered to travel from Florida to St. Louis to testify before the jury. When she took the stand, she did not hesitate. She and Chris had been seeing each other since November 2008. He had promised her a life together. He had given her a ring, a symbol of their future. And then she dropped the most damning revelation yet. Chris Coleman had told her he planned to serve Sheri with the divorce papers on May 4th or 5th, the very same day his wife and children were brutally murdered. The defense floundered, pushing the narrative that some unknown figure had hacked Chris's computer to send the threatening messages and then somehow infiltrated the home, slaughtering his entire family while he was away at the gym. But their version of the events crumbled under the weight of the prosecution's evidence. And Chris Coleman? He never took the stand. Not once. Not a word in his own defense. For 9 days, the courtroom bore witness to the tangled mess of deception, obsession, and cold-blooded murder. And as the trial drew close, there was a little doubt about who has orchestrated this nightmare. The only question that remained: how long would it take the jury to seal Chris Coleman's fate? On May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years after the brutal murders of Sheri Garrett Coleman, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. For 2 days, the jurors had been locked in deliberation, sitting through the tangled web of evidence. Most of them were certain from the beginning. Chris Coleman had killed his wife and sons. But 4 jurors held out, demanding more proof. And then, almost by accident, they found it. Tucked away in the jury room were photographs overlooked but damning. They were of Chris and Tara Lynch, his mistress, cozying up to each other. The dates printed on the back: October 2008, not November, as Chris had always claimed. This wasn't just a minor discrepancy. It was proof that he had been lying from the start. That realization shattered any remaining doubt. Holdouts on the jury were convinced. Chris Coleman was guilty. Days after his conviction, Coleman made a stunning decision. Instead of letting the jury determine his punishment, he placed his fate in the hands of Judge Milton Wharton. It was a move that caught everyone off guard. As juror Kim Ferrari later told Fox News, "It was a surprise, but I think he knew that we were going to sentence him to the death penalty." Judge Wharton spared him that fate. Instead, he handed down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of a parole. Ferrari wasn't disappointed. In a way, the death penalty had already been rendered moot. Just 2 months before Coleman's conviction, Illinois Governor Pat Quinn had abolished it entirely. Even if the jury had sentenced him to die, it would have been nothing more than a symbolic punishment. Coleman was transferred to Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois, but he didn't stay there long. In August 2011, he was quietly moved to Dodge Correctional Institute in Waupun, Wisconsin, a decision made for his own safety. Chris Coleman refused to accept his fate. Even after his conviction was upheld in 2015, he continued fighting to overturn his life sentence. But every appeal hit a dead end. In April 2018, he made another attempt to rewrite the story. From behind bars, he reached out to Crime Watch Daily, hoping to cast doubt on the evidence that had sealed his fate. His father, Pastor Ron Coleman, stood by him, just as he always had. Ron never wavered in his belief that his son had been wrongfully convicted. To Ron, the affair wasn't a motive for murder. He brushed it off as something that simply happened when a man's needs weren't being met at home. Tara was just meeting a need at the time Sheri wasn't taken care of, he explained. Then he went further, justifying his son's infidelity. Every man has desires, and every man has to be respected. It's built into every man. If your wife doesn't respect you, then you're going to find respect someplace else. And when asked if Sheri had failed as a wife, he didn't hesitate. Just that, at that brief time, she stepped back from doing her job as a wife. Even as Ron defended his son, Coleman's attorneys were already planning their next one. That same month, they had filed for a new trial, arguing that improper evidence, the extra photos discovered by jurors, had unfairly influenced the verdict. The courts agreed to hear the argument. In March 2019, a judge granted on evidentiary hearing a small but significant step toward a possible retrial. But by July 2020, it was all over. The judge denied the appeal, closing the door on Coleman's last chance at freedom. Chris Coleman would spend the rest of his life behind bars. His father could preach his innocence. His lawyers could argue his fairness, but the courts had spoken. The jury had spoken, and the truth had already been written in blood. With the final denial of his appeal, Chris Coleman's fate was sealed. No more hearings, second chances, just the cold reality of a life spent behind prison walls. Outside, the world moved on. Sheri's family had long since reclaimed their loved ones, laying them to rest near Chicago, far from the town where they had murdered. The gravestone at Evergreen Cemetery remained, paid for by Coleman's parents, a silent reminder of a family shattered by betrayal. Chris Coleman's family fought bitterly to stop it. His parents, Ron and Connie Coleman, had waged a long legal battle, insisting the boys belonged in Chester, where their grandparents could visit them. But in the end, law sided with Sheri's family. A convicted murderer, the judge ruled, should not have the power to control the resting place of his victims. For the people of Columbia, Illinois, the case that once crippled the small town faded into memory. The house on Robert Drive, where unspeakable horrors unfolded, was eventually demolished and erased from the landscape like a wound trying to heal. But some wounds never fully heal. A mother and two little boys were gone, taken in the most brutal way imaginable by the man who was supposed to love and protect them. The walls of Pontiac Correctional Center closed in around him, a life sentence more fitting than any execution, because death would have been an ending. Instead, he was left with the rest of his days to sit in a cell, and nothing but time and the weight of what he had done. Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to subscribe to my podcast on Spotify and YouTube so you never miss an update. I appreciate you joining me today. Have an amazing weekend ahead. Until then, stay safe, crime enthusiasts.